Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, my name is Nick Marshall. I'm the head of exhibitions and programs at the George Eastman Museum. Welcome to today's virtual conversation with artists Bea Nettles and Joan Lyons. This program was originally intended to be in person at the museum, but due to the current COVID-19 health-related concerns in our area, we had to move the conversation online. So thank you all for understanding our need to shift the program and for joining us today. If you have questions at any point throughout today's talk, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That button might be at the top depending on where what type of device you're using. But at the end of the conversation, we'll go through as many of your questions that we have time for. The chat function is open, so if you'd like to drop us a line and say hello or let us know where you're tuning in from, please feel free to use the chat icon for that purpose. But we'll not be monitoring that for questions for Bea and Joan. So any questions for the artists, please use the Q&A button. We are recording today's webinar and we'll be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to go back and watch again or share with others, you'll be able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. We have closed captioning function on Zoom turned on, but if you'd like to turn it off, you can click on the CC icon either at the bottom or top of your screen and disable it. And I should note that while Zoom's closed captioning is a really great feature to be able to have. Sometimes it's not the most accurate at interpretation, particularly when we're talking about some of the technical language specific to photography. So just bear that in mind as you're following along. And with that, I'll turn it over to today's moderator, Jamie Allen, who is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Curator and Interim Head in the Department of Photography here at Eastman Museum. Jamie.
Thanks so much, Nick. And welcome everyone. I was looking through the list of people who have joined us today and so many fantastic colleagues are here today. So thank you for taking the time out to join us in this conversation today. Today's conversation is going to be pretty casual. I just had the great fortune to have the opportunity to work with Bea on a retrospective exhibition and book project, which was a collaboration with Olivia Los Gonzalez and the Sheldon Art Galleries in St. Louis, Missouri. And we could have equally done that same project for so many individuals. And as I was thinking about other artists who would be great to have in conversation with us, Joan, of course, came to mind. And it really got me to thinking about Rochester and the importance of Rochester to the photography community, particularly in those years of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where things really, I'll just say it, kind of blew up. So I'm really pleased to have Joan and Bea here today with us. So in starting our conversation, I just thought I'd open it up with allowing Bea and Joan to tell us a little bit about the foundations of their art careers. And in particular, perhaps the moment where you thought that you had made it, where you thought, this is it, I'm an artist, this is my livelihood. If hopefully you felt that at some point in your life. So maybe tell us a little bit about that moment where you thought, this is my job, this is my career, and I'm super excited to be here. Do you want to start, Bea?
Sure, because I know I told you this once, I think I did. When I was in grad school, I got a letter in my mailbox from the Museum of Modern Art, and I thought it was a book club promo thing and I almost threw it out. But it was from Peter Bunnell, and he was putting together a show called Photography into Sculpture. And Robert Fichter had told him about my work, and Peter flew out, picked some work, put it into photography, into sculpture. And of course, I thought I had it made at that point. This is easy, this is what you do. Of course, it became apparent that you had to keep at it a lot harder and be flexible and so forth. But I'd say it all started for me about 1970. So, good 50 years.
And for those in our audience who may not be aware, Peter Bonnell is a pretty seminal figure in the history of photography and just recently passed away.
Yes.
Today. So my heart is with you for those who are mourning that loss. Joan, do you want to tell us a little bit about the foundations of your art career and then that moment that was your moment to shine?
Well, excuse me. I thought about this question, and I don't really think I ever thought about, excuse me, I seem to have a frog here. Great way to start. I don't think I ever thought about whether or not I made it as an artist. And in thinking about it, I think that if I've made it as a human being, it's greatly due to having done the work, and the work, being an enormous part of development as a person and a major means of communicating.
I love that perspective. I love that idea that it's just your life, right? Art is your life, and that's what keeps you going, and perhaps is what your legacy is, and leaves a piece of you in the world. And I would definitely say I can see that in both of your work, as both of your work is very personal in nature and really about your day-to-day life. I think that makes me want to jump ahead to that idea of moments in your careers where something happens in your life that then drives a change in your work or your working patterns. And I know for both of you, being a mother and an artist and also educators, all of those things are really influential in the moments that you have to make art and to devote yourself to that craft. Do you want to speak a little bit about being a mother and being an artist and being kind of at that point in your career where you have to adjust to the things that are around you?
Want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. And I can also talk about pre-motherhood, just being adaptive. And Joan was really good at this too. We would just use, and I think we could have another whole session on that, but we would use whatever technology was on hand to try things. And so a lot of my work was driven by being excited about some new technique or something else I could try that might do what I've been wanting to do. So I'll talk about that in a bit when that is appropriate. I think the main thing with kids, having children, was I used those lessons of being adaptable to keep working. And prior to having children, especially having any children, and then when having two, it got even more complicated. I could work during little breaks, but I had to change the style of my art to things that I could stop and start. And so the body of work close to home is a good case in point versus the body of work Flamingo in the Dark. Flamingo in the Dark, or even dye transfer prints, were terribly frustrating because if it was time to pick up a kid at the daycare center, you had to trash it, put it away, flush it down the sink or whatever, and get going. So there were lots of constraints on my time, which influenced what technique, what style I would work in. I'm not talking content at this point. I'm just talking about the approach to the work.
And we talked in our conversations about that happened earlier in your career too, when you moved to Rochester to work at the Nazareth University or college. Mm-hmm. And that idea of now you're spending your days doing this job, yeah, that you want to come home and still make art, and that idea that you have to adapt to what you're making just to fit the time that you have.
Right. And your energy level too. Because the first job I had was at Nazareth College, and it was 5 course preparations, little 1 credit, 2 credit courses, but everything. And that was lucky for me, I knew how to teach a lot of different things. That's how I got that job. I wasn't just teaching photography. I taught design, one point drawing, photography, you know, various subjects, but many of them were very low credit courses, but they take just as much work to prepare. So I get home pretty exhausted. That's when I did the notebooks, the 3-ring binder notebooks, and that felt doable.
And for those in the audience, I've put together a slideshow, so you're kind of getting a sense of Bea and Joan's work in tandem against each other from this kind of late 60s into the 80s time period. And there's sort of a section of more artistic prints at the beginning, and then a section of books at the end, and you'll see one of Bea's binder books pop in there for a moment. Joan, you had 3 very young children all at once in the 60s, which, you know, it's like you're managing your household and you have your kids. And so what impact did that have on your artistic practice, and how did you adapt your time and space to make that happen, or perhaps your media as well?
Well, first, I would just like to point out that for this slideshow, I selected pretty much all portraits, all images of people, just to have some more, you know, continuity and progression between the different periods of work. Although, you know, I did do other things. So
You sure did.
yes, you did a lot of things.
Any other thing?
Well, yeah, I think my experience was similar to Bea's, but a little different in that I had 3 children very early. You know, I was quite young. And so I was still kind of figuring out how to be a human and how to be an adult and raising these children. And the work was vital to you know, keep my head above water. So, you know, like Bea, you managed to find, you know, some time to do it and to adapt your process to the time that was allocated. And in the 60s, I was painting mostly. I was making painting and drawings and some, you know, very small amount of screen print work, because that was the only facility I had. And I don't know how I managed to work on paintings in the hour and a half or 2 hours a day that I had, but you know, but I did somehow. And I think, you know, I think women just have to learn, you know, to do all these things simultaneously. You just fit it all in somehow.
I think it's interesting that you said that women have to learn to do that. Like, that's a very pointed,
Yeah.
that is something unique to the experience of women, that perhaps the juggling act, I think, as Bea referred to it at some point, right? The juggling act of being all the different things that you're supposed to be in life is just part of our livelihood.
Well, women of you know, our generation, Bea's and mine anyhow, really had primary responsibility for children.
And managing the household, and but then also we're able to break into being in the workforce and being more independent. And I think that path really blazed a trail for all of us that followed you, to be able to kind of find balance in our lives in a different way. So I want to return to this idea that both of you have now touched on, which is the process and the media that you use. And one of the things I really love about both of your careers is that you use every media format, tool, whatever it is that you have access to, you utilize it, which means that your careers both go from painting and drawing. Bea's edges on sculptural, there's installation pieces in Joan's work, photography, bookmaking, printmaking, it's all in there all together, and in some cases all together on one work of art. So tell us a little bit about perhaps a pivotal moment where you switched processes or switched from painting to drawing to photography or bookmaking, and what the impetus was there and how you really felt that new media was going to meet the needs of your art practice.
Well,
Go ahead, Joan, go.
It's a big question, so.
it's a big question, yes. Well, I made a conscious decision to stop painting on canvas in the late 60s because it seemed to not make any sense for a lot of reasons. It didn't make any sense politically. There were museums standing in line to show these big things. Then I realized I was also happier making work on paper. So I reverted to that. And I didn't use photographic images at all in my work until I think 1969 was the first. And before that, I had used a lot of things like stencils and rubbings, means of bringing the real world into the work. So photography began to enter my work in that way. I never thought about taking pictures or shooting pictures. I thought more about recording or collecting images from the world to enter into the work. And I think that was a real distinction. And likewise, I never really separated the media I worked in. I worked in, drawing and print, later digital media, books, and they were pretty much all of the same piece. And I think, one of the things that's been central, as Bea said, the materials around us, we just picked up whatever was there, and that was, an impetus for the work. But also it was important to me to have images exist in an extended space. In other words, I think quite early on, the idea of a single image was less interesting than a group of images engaging one another, whether it was a book or a wall piece or a portfolio.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think that, a lot of people consider portfolios just to be like a body of photographs that you could purchase in a neat little package, and then you get 10 instead of 1. But I think for you, your portfolios are much more like a book work or an installation work where all the pieces really tell a larger story. And so that idea of an extended space, that you have more than one sheet of paper to tell the story is a really interesting concept. Where did that idea of the extended space rise out of for you? Because I know your background in design work and book design and some of those things perhaps has influenced that, but where do you think it came from?
Well, I did a lot of graphic design work always. I designed books, I designed posters, I designed brochures. I mean, always, that was always, I don't know whether to say the way I earned a living, but part of what I did, and didn't separate it out too severely from my personal work. There was a lot of talk about the idea of photographic sequence and so forth. Nathan was Mr. Sequence, but I don't think that I understood or practiced that in my work in any of the sense that he did. Okay, these little books, for instance, they're a series of 10 little perspectives, and each one is a single image that is repeated and then cut in such a way that it fans out to try and represent the kind of perspective. Well, one of those might have been interesting, but 10 of them that were varied, I think, were more interesting in extending an idea, and that's like a simple explanation of one piece.
I think that's a very useful explanation. Bea, I want to let you get to the question of
Sure.
the idea of using all different media and what comes to you, and you know, what pivots you to the book format besides the binder book. I know is kind of that early version of that, but what are the impetuses that move you through the different media and the different processes that you used?
Okay, well, first of all, people don't always realize both of my degrees were in painting, painting and heavily printmaking as well. So I took photography kind of late in my career. It was the senior year at the University of Florida. And so I started incorporating photographs about the same time Joan mentioned that she did, around 68, 69 in my work, but I was doing all sorts of other things. And I continue to always do all sorts of other things. And that makes the work really hard to classify and to categorize. And it drove people nuts. And I think it probably still does. Although it is interesting how things have kind of looped back around. The work that I did in Flamingo in the Dark, for example, or the tarot deck that I did, that's the first photographic tarot card deck in the world. Those were all done with multiple negatives and blends and techniques that you try to explain what it was like before Photoshop to people, and they just get glazed over. And you just really can't imagine those times. Or even, I mean, Joan would remember this too, even before it was easy to put color into a photograph. Here's a case in point, you know, if I wanted that kind of color look, I had to paint it or tone it or add it. There's no way I could have done that on a color piece of colored photo paper, because that was also very toxic and elitist, and very few people could do it. So there were ideas that I had in my head that couldn't be done, at least in traditional, in given ways, in ways that were around in common. Joan used the Haloid Xerox tons more than I did, but I used it some. I could see its potential. It was a lot to me like drawings and prints. Here's an example. This isn't a Haloid. This is a photo screen print of me seated in front of a curtain, but the rest is drawn, and that was done because I couldn't do photolitho. I didn't know how to do it. I took the screen print, I screened on a litho plate, I etched it, and I made a photolitho that way. So I would work my way around, but I found through grad school and beyond, I became more and more interested in having photos and things. And just like Joan, I didn't shoot photos or take photos. I always said I made photos, and they were constructed. Very rarely were they straight. Here's another example. I mean, this was several negatives, and I was actually, you curators called me on this, but I was shocked how many times I'd use the same negative over and over, and you'd find it used different ways. And part of that was the expense. Film was expensive. It's not like digital. You had to think about it. You had to develop the film. So if you had a good negative, I've had no qualms about using it frequently in various techniques and in various ways. So I don't know if I've gotten to the gist of that question, but
Well, definitely.
Okay.
You mentioned Joan's Haloid prints, so I'm going to zoom ahead in our presentation and see if I can sort of pause it there so that Joan can speak a little bit more.
There we go. There's one.
So bear with me as I toggle back and forth here if this tries to keep going on me. But Joan, do you want to talk a little bit about the Haloid process?
Yeah, well, for I'd say 10 years, I used this as my primary camera, and what it was, just briefly, was like a big view camera that imaged a Xerox plate instead of film. And then, like Xerox, you could transfer the image to paper or to a plate. So as Bea was using a silkscreen to get a photographic image on a lithoplate, I was using these haloid transfers. Some were lithographs, some were one-of-a-kind drawings. These were some early ones, and these were collages because I hadn't yet learned how to do this transfer process. So I was limited in size. But I like the idea of a portrait as something other than a captured instant. I was interested in making a portrait over a period of time that wasn't instantaneous, that might take a day to complete, that was awkward in its parts because the parts were put together in a constructed manner. So the monolithic figure was really built out of separate images and separate moments in time. And you know, that would, and also what I loved about the haloid was, you know, as Bea suggested, we were doing anything we could to get a photographic image on plain paper. It's the easiest thing in the world to do today, but
yeah, or fabric. I wanted it on fabric, you know, it was very hard.
Yes, difficult, right?
Yeah, impossible. Fabric, yeah.
Here's a couple of examples of fabric pieces that
Right.
we did.
Yeah, gum print was impossible. I only did a few of those.
Yeah,
Because
that was nasty.
seriously, this is not what I want. This is better. This is liquid light. But on fabric too, that was very touch and go. And so I made a few, but not a lot of those. Yeah.
I did a lot of screen printing on fabric.
Yeah. And then eventually we both, well, there's a lot we can't show, but discovered cyanotype and Van Dyke Brown, and you know the way those various techniques would work. You're flipping through some magazine rubbings, learning there from the art world. You know, Rauschenberg doing transfers. This is a combination of a transfer and this is Inco dye. This is something that I probably made 3 of them, and then I realized this stuff isn't permanent. Sorry if you own it. I can't remember who owns this.
Yeah, we own it.
You know, this stuff, it is going to fade or change or whatever. So I can't really make too much. I will say something here though about permanence. I didn't worry about that too much. I was going to make things, and you know, I wasn't thinking about longevity. I mean, I'd make things well, and I respect good craftsmanship and using my materials well. But still, if someone said, you know, that's a little bit impermanent, it's like, okay, well, I'm sorry, but I want to do it, you know, and I'm going to try it. So most of the stuff is actually hung on quite a long time, surprisingly.
Seems to be doing okay on our walls.
Well, you heard the story about the swamp box, the piece of sculpture that I made that I tried to ship from home to home as I was moving around, and it finally got lost on a shipping truck, and it went out to California, and they said badly scratched cabinet, and I barely got it back. They thought it was a piece of junk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so speaking of moving from home to home,
Yes.
let's think about Rochester a little bit and what brought each of you to Rochester. But then also, Rochester was such a photo hub, I would think of in the 1960s and 70s, just the number of people who in my career I've run into and said, oh yeah, I was at the Eastman Museum, oh I was at VSW, oh I was at RIT. It seemed like everybody came through as an intern or teaching a workshop or just coming to visit at that point in time. So how'd you get to Rochester? And then what was your experience in Rochester like as just being in a community that was such a photo hub with you know, Eastman Museum, and then the foundations of VSW and RIT and all the different things coming and going here?
You want me to start?
Joan arrived first in Rochester.
Let Joan start, and I'll tell you how I came in.
Yes, I arrived in Rochester in 1960. And I
didn't get that. Could you try again?
my watch is talking to me. I wasn't talking to you. I came here because I married Nathan and he was here. So here I was in Rochester in the 60s. And, it was difficult at first. So my life in the 60s revolved around children, working in my attic, showing in a very good local gallery, entertaining and listening to hordes and hordes of photographers, mostly male. There were pretty interesting things going on. I was peripheral to them at that point. And then when Visual Studies Workshop started in 1969, I think.
Yes.
I was more, directly engaged in the community, and very quickly by 1972, I had started Visual Studies Workshop Press. I don't know if I had any conscious intent to start an artist press. I had an unconscious intent to do so, but there was an old press, and I learned how to run it, and I had graphic design background and some printing background. And pretty soon, we had a lot of people show up. I mean, it was amazing. In the early 70s, people like Robert Frank and Jim Paik and dozens of others did residencies. Other people came by. Our student body was amazing. A lot of them were older and professional. But anyhow, pretty soon people started showing up, hearing there was a press and wanted to make books. Actually, Bea made some books with us at the press.
Did.
Yes.
I
And
could
that,
include at least one in the presentation today, the
yeah,
Island.
Yeah.
right. So I think at that time we were just doing things. It was wide open. Nothing was really intentional, but it was a time of incredible changing technologies. Copy machines first became available, camcorders. People were doing performance and installation work. Artist spaces were beginning to arise. There was an incredible, mobility of young artists, crisscrossing the country and the world to go to centers where things were happening. And Rochester, of course, between the workshop and the Eastman House and RIT was certainly, one of those places.
Definitely. Bea, do you want to touch on your
Sure.
arrival in Rochester and then perhaps working at RIT and
Okay. Well, I came along in 1970, and little did I know, I mean, I was really stepping into the major center of everything. It was wonderful. But I came, as I mentioned, to teach at Nazareth College, which was a small, at that point, women's school. And I was teaching everything, not just photo, but the photo community welcomed me, which was wonderful. And I still remember meeting Joan and Nathan and many other people who became long-term friends and contacts at Betty Hahn's house for a potluck dinner. She had a bunch of people over, and it was wonderful. And I taught there for the first year, and I had actually my first show was at the Eastman, at that point, the Eastman House in the fall of that year, and in through the spring. And it was at that show that the people from RIT saw my work and offered me a job. They said, you should really apply to this job out at RIT that's going to open up. Because one of the two women that taught there was leaving. So I did. I applied and I got the job.
you should say one of two women out of a faculty of
50.
Yeah.
Yeah, 48 men, 2 women. And it was Judy. I'm sorry, I can't think of the last name right now. But so I was out there the next year. Betty Hahn was still there, and I was there. We taught together. I think they put us in the same office. At any rate, at one point I shared an office with Betty, and she was a real wonderful mentor. I went to her first I first saw gum printing in a workshop that Betty taught. I'm sure Joan showed me how to use the Haloid machine. Joan taught me how to make halftone negatives. There was mentoring going on, a lot of sharing of energy. I also at Nazareth was where I met my husband, Lionel Suntop. He came in first month or so that I was there. I had this appointment with this person, Lionel Suntop, who was coming in to sell me books from a new startup business called Light Impressions. And I was the new person in town, and he thought I would buy them for the library. And I enjoyed meeting Lionel. And I sent him a show announcement to the Eastman show, and he saw my work. And after I'd gone to Europe that next summer, I came back and started to date Lionel, and we've been married ever since. In marrying Lionel, I also forged an incredible relationship, professional relationship as well, but with the book world and what was called at that point, for lack of a better term, the photo book. It's not exactly an artist book, and it's not a coffee table book. It's a very specific kind of book that is sequential, or at least there's some kind of series going on in the book if it's done well. And a lot of times there were words and images. They were fascinating books, and anyone who was making a book or thinking about making a book would come through or send it to Rochester, and often have these guys at Light Impressions look at it, because it's one thing to make a book, it's another thing to sell a book. And that's what they were doing. And they started first with like personal trips to libraries and bookstores and so forth, but eventually with a mail order catalog. Because again, this is pre-digital, internet, none of that, no Amazon. If you wanted a book, you had to first hear about it. And there were lots of postcards and mailings going out, sticking stamps. When my kids were little, we called it doing, I forget what we had a name for it, but Inky Press or something. It was like doing mailings. There was an awful lot of marketing going on. And I used to teach my students business skills and marketing and getting your work out, because, a lot of artists just think it happens by magic. It doesn't. And I learned a lot of that there. And thanks to mentors and what was going on in the town. Okay, so I'm out at RIT and I'm teaching. And after about a year there, I get an offer to go to Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia and teach with William Larson. He brought me out, he offered me the job. It was too good to refuse. So I went away for a couple of years, but then I came back, married Lionel, and actually worked at Light Impressions for a little while. I taught at the VSW for us. It was a NEA, it was funny money, it was like a grant of some sort for a semester, which was also really fun. And that was where I taught my first artist book class. I had a few students who went on to do some pretty amazing things, but I taught an artist book class. I taught alternative photo processes at the VSW. And then, lucky me, another job opened up at RIT. Again, another woman left, I think. And I got that job back, and I began to teach again. Pretty much the same job description, although at that point I was teaching more of the fine art photo students, not all the basic photo students. And I taught there till 84 when we left for Illinois.
Right.
So those institutions were really important to me.
So I think one of the questions that's come in on the Q&A is a little bit in tandem with one of the questions I have. So I'm kind of interested in VSW Press and Light Impressions, and the idea that work is being disseminated through books that are quite affordable by that time. But also just the question that's come through is, how is your work received during this, what we'll consider the early period of your work, kind of that 60s, 70s, maybe even early 80s? How is it received by the public? Where did you have the opportunities to share your work? I know Bea mentioned having an exhibit here, but I know both of you had work in exhibitions at MoMA and other institutions. And then just how was it received? Those kinds of, tell us about like, were people collecting your work at that point? You know, what was it like being in the art world?
Joan, you want to go?
Sure. Well, I don't know how connected I was to the art world. I think, okay, this is a good example. I think that the only show I ever had in New York, well, early on there was some funny little show, but was in one summer in the 70s. I think Light Gallery gave a show to myself and John Wood, and I forgot who the third person was. You know, three people doing funny photography.
Still the bro, I bet. Was it still?
I don't remember, but because they figured the summer was okay. It was a pretty dead season and you could show all this funny stuff. And I remember clearly a review somewhere that started, who do these people think they are, calling themselves photographers? So that was pretty much the attitude of the art world. I never called myself a photographer. I don't think John defined himself in any particular way. But I mean, it was very difficult because the photo print thing was very separate, and neither camp was interested in anything that looked like it fit into the other. So, you know, I never really showed in New York at all until 2 years ago. I showed a lot in university galleries and so forth, who, you know, were more open and receptive to different kinds of work. And I must admit, I never really did anything to get my work out, just because I didn't have time or energy for that. I mean, I just didn't. I was happy that I could continue to do work.
There was the gallery here in Rochester that showed your work.
Yeah, paintings in the 60s, the Schumann Gallery, which was a wonderful gallery.
Yeah.
And they did show.
I was super lucky with gallery initially. When Harold left the Eastman,
Right.
the Eastman House at that point to form Light Gallery.
The Harold Jones. I just want to
Yeah,
put
Harold Jones. Yeah. He invited me to be one of his first artists in the stable. And again, this is interesting, but there were a dozen, and then there were 13, and I was the only woman. So it was always like that fairy tale where you suddenly think, oh, I better set the table and bring in another seat. But it wasn't really that way. I didn't even think about the fact that it was so out of proportion. I was just thrilled to be there. But I was showing some pretty weird stuff. I mean, I had the Kool-Aid hearts and mixed things in that show. So there was a range that Light Gallery showed. Yeah. And I was in their stable for a couple of years, but then there came the point where I was really interested in making books. I was living in Philadelphia. I had access there to a very nice eventually there was a press, but I had a wonderful process camera that I could make halftones, and I put together some books that you've been showing in this sequence, I think, the Events in the Sky, Events in the Water. Had those books printed just at a little print shop in Philadelphia. Those were selling for $10 a book, and I only made maybe 100 copies. Those are cheap, and they were sold through Light Impressions catalog, and I was really interested in doing that. But at Light Gallery, they were in the drawers. You know, they just couldn't make money on a $10 book. And when it became obvious that I wouldn't get an exhibition of books, I would have to continue to do sort of wall work. I stayed on for a little while longer, but I was more and more involved in the books that I was making. And actually, that's what I was making for several years there in the 70s, various forms of books. I didn't know how to bind a book. They were stapled, they were ring binders. You know, it took me a long time, like another decade or two, to really know how to put books together properly. So I left Light Gallery. I went over to Whitkin Gallery for a while. And by that point I had cycled back into doing what was called quick print. And I did have wall work again but the timing had just been off with Light Gallery. So I showed at Whitkin for a couple of years. And Whitkin talked to Betty Hahn and I at one point. We were there sitting on the sofa just talking about things. And he said, you know, really, Betty, you and Bea shouldn't be showing in photo galleries. You should be showing as painters or something. And we both knew that it's better to be a little big fish, I guess, in a small pond. We didn't have a hope in the major big painting art world. We felt like we'd at least gotten a little bit of a foot in the door in the world that we were in. And there's no way I would have tried that route. But even then, after a while, I left Whitkin because I felt like I wasn't going to get another exhibition. And that was a mistake. I wish I'd stayed, but sometimes you mess up. And I think that's the question I was trying to answer. I forget, but
No.
Yeah, okay, well.
the art world, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joan.
Well, I must say, I mean, I was promoting something, not my own work, that I was just happy to keep doing, but I was promoting VSW Press and, you know, Bea's experience of, you know, making catalogs and doing mailings and mailing lists. And I think we had a couple of beginning little book fairs in the 70s. And that world was kind of exploding. We were very idealistic about it. We thought that these inexpensive books were going to become real commodities.
Yeah.
Which they didn't. However, they were, you know, they were wonderful. People were getting interested in them. But I think, you know, to get back to the work. So, you know, my work was really, you know, the only place I could pay attention to my, you know, internal world. Work being, you know, this place where the personal and the public intersect in some way, and we're able to moderate that internal and personal history with political and social existence that we all have. So this kind of practice and those kind of ideas were really important and central to that work, and also, you know, were important to the kind of work I felt we were doing at Visual Studies Workshop to give that kind of voice and venue and ability to produce a work to you know, many artists. So I can't really emphasize what an incredibly you know, rich experience that was to have an artist come in for a month and actually make a book in a hands-on kind of way, that kind of mentorship. So I just like to make that evident that in many ways I didn't really separate, you know, that practice from, you know, what I was doing in my personal work. And that may be why it might have been less important for me to actually, you know, find venues, get my work out, because I felt that in a way I was involved in a semi-public space, you know, through my daily life.
That, yeah.
And Joan, I used to teach your books. I had copies of your books, and you know, I show them to my students.
And I showed yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the little books did have a life. The one really successful book that I did during that time was a textbook. It wasn't an artist book. It was called Breaking the Rules.
Yes.
A photo media cookbook, and that was done pretty early on when I was really on the road a lot, especially when I was between college teaching jobs. I took every workshop I could get and taught pretty constantly the alternative photo processes. And I had really good handouts, really good notes, because they were practiced. I mean, I could tell whether they worked or confused people or whatever. And there was a point where somebody took my notes and Xeroxed them and was like using them. And I thought, that's just not right. I don't think that's particularly right. I did all that work. And so that was Lionel's idea. He said, you know, you should put it together as a book yourself. And he sort of made me do it, and I did it. And I knew enough by that point about mocking up a book, getting it typeset, getting it to the printing press and so forth. There was an independent printing house there that the workshop used to print after image that I used for several books called Mohawk Press. And Breaking the Rules was printed at Mohawk Press. And I would go in and I talked to the guys. I'd swear with the guys. I mean, I learned a lot about printing just by being around printers. And they always appreciated the fact that you appreciated their work. Anyway, that book, self-published and distributed by Light Impressions, probably sold 35,000 copies.
35,000.
Yes, a lot of copies, which is way over the periods of years. It went into 3 editions. And if you notice, if you have an early edition, you got me in a little sundress with an Instamatic standing in front of the Last Supper. If you have a later edition, I'm in an 80s power suit with a different kind of camera, and you know, like matured, the book matured a bit, and I added a few more things, but then I got sick of revising it and I let it go. But I still find people who said that's how they heard about my work. Mm-hmm. And one big thank you to the Eastman for showing the actual real work is this, that people come up to me and say, oh, I really like your work. I've always liked your work. And I'll say, where did you see it? That's great. And then they get this sort of glazed look and they realize they've never seen my work. They've seen it in books. They've seen reproductions of my work or that particular textbook or whatever, but they've never seen the actual work. And that's been what's so wonderful about this exhibition. If people will get in there and actually see the scale, the texture, the stitching, all of that, it's such an opportunity. And that's one thing that's been so heartbreaking for all of us during this period, but especially with COVID. And the show had traveled 3 different places, and in the last 2, there was a lot of lockdown, a lot of scrambling around trying to make it, again, a reproduction of the work and share the ideas. So I think one thing to be gained from that is the knowledge that it is really good to see the actual texture and scale and all that, but also ideas can be conveyed lots of ways. And a lot of those ideas that I had, I think, did convey themselves pretty well through the printed page and through books. I'd say perhaps less so on the internet and, web pages and podcasts and all that sort of thing. But there are some pretty good YouTube videos where I talk about my work and so forth, but it's still nothing like seeing the real thing. And thank you, Jamie.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure. We're coming up on the end of our hour together, which these conversations are never long enough. But I do want to try to hit on one more question, and building on what you all just said about the idea that your work is not just your artistic work, but your educational work, your publishing work, the work that you did helping others realize their dreams. I think is really fantastic, and in a way speaks to feminism and that idea that Joan introduced earlier in our conversation, that that as women or as individuals, that our work is really to kind of move our conversations forward and do our day-to-day work of being and creating, and allowing others to have space to do that as well. So the question that came through is, how does your work relate to feminism? And I know that, you know, in the conversations Bea and I have had, that maybe early on you didn't really think about that as part of your work, but I think most people would read both of your work as very feminist work. And to me, that day-to-day practice of teaching and educating and disseminating and sharing and publishing is also maybe a movement towards that. So if you can, in 1 or 2 minutes, what do you think about that idea of feminism in your work and your daily practice?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I was in art school in the 50s, and if you wanted to be an artist, you had to do something macho and universal and abstract. And I tried my best to fit into that form, into that mold. And, you know, I slung paints and I tried to be a little tough, and, you know, I failed miserably, I think. And it was very hard for me to do anything else, because that's what the art world and making art was about. And then little by little, through the 60s and 70s, I began to just, you know, compulsively want to do something else. I wanted to explore the particular and the personal. I did a huge series of images of women that were kind of, I call them portraits, but they were more archetypes. They were an investigation into the feminine. And it was through those images that, you know, I began to figure out my life. And at that time, there were women doing this all over the country, I think in the same way. I didn't know about feminism. I didn't know other women who were making that kind of work until, you know, 10 or 15 years later, when I realized that there were women all over the country and all over the world, you know, doing those same kinds of explorations. Some were lucky enough to be in, you know, New York or LA, where they had communities, but others of us were just spontaneously, you know, finding this. And I don't know, you know, what's more mainstream about male subject matter and procedure than female, what women do anyhow. But it's taken a long time to get to that point.
That it has.
Well, maybe, I don't know.
Maybe, maybe not. I think in that way, the work that you all did created a path and made space for people to tell more intimate and personal stories in our exhibition spaces today. You know, if I think about the shows that we have up right now, we have Jess Dugan's work from To Survive on the Shore. We have upcoming Joshua Rashad McFadden's work, and those are highly personal and public stories that they're telling, intimate stories that they're telling. And I think that we've opened up that pathway, that your generation opened up that pathway for artists today. Bea, did you want to respond to the feminism question? Or
Well, a bit. I wasn't even particularly, just like Joan, aware of the word, certainly in my education and in the first few years working at RIT and so forth. And it wasn't till the mid 70s, even the early 80s, when I would be identified as a woman photographer, or The Woman's Eye, for example, came out. And I certainly didn't begrudge being in that book, and Ann did a really good job of Ann Tucker with the book, The Woman's Eye. But I never would have called myself a feminist at that point. It took a while, some reading and so forth. But I was just butt-headed enough to do what I wanted to do, and a lot of it. And that was probably watching my mother, who was my role model really in all of this. She had 5 children, went back to graduate school when the 5th one hit kindergarten, became a college teacher and had a 22-year teaching career, and retired roughly about my age now. She was about 72 when she finally retired. And I saw her beginning to write poetry in her 50s. And for 20 years, she wrote incredible poetry. So we had a collaboration going, which sort of gave me a tremendous support system. But I was always involved in doing personal work. And also, as Joan said, archetypes, thinking in turn. And I wouldn't think about archetypes. You don't have to, because if you get right down to it, that's the way a lot of imagery emerges. Is I wouldn't say it's universal, but it does touch a lot of lives, even if it is just a picture of you. You know, it all depends on what you're doing and what you're talking about. And also, I don't remember which book of mine, but I talk, it may even be in the book that you published, about how sharing is so important in my practice, in my teaching, and in my work, and in my life.
Well, I think that brings us to time, that our hour is closed, and hopefully the individuals in Q&A feel that I got to their questions there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bea and Joan, and for sharing your stories. Sharing is, I think, exactly how we learn from our past and move into our future. Thank you to our audience for coming today, and thank you to my colleagues, Nick Marshall and Kate Myers-Emery, for making today's PowerPoint possible and for making this Zoom presentation possible. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.